We start with a stark snapshot of the scale of global conflict. The International Rescue Committee has released its 2025 report titled New World Disorder. It lays out the top 20 countries at greatest risk of new or worsening humanitarian emergencies. From those countries, 50% of people live in extreme poverty. 80% of people have been forced to flee their homes, and 89% of people are in humanitarian need. This comes at a time when humanitarian support is declining. This year saw a $31 billion fall in aid from countries who have typically been the largest donors, painting a troubling portrait of the state of global humanitarian aid. David Miliband is the International Rescue Committee President and CEO. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me on.
This report is staggering. You write that crises are surging, the global support to address them is collapsing. What is a new world disorder that you describe?
I think a new world disorder is defined by weakening international cooperation, trampling of rights of the most vulnerable people in the world who are civilians caught up in conflict in places like Sudan, and profiteering from conflict that we're seeing in increasing numbers of the places where we work. And this new world disorder is not just a phrase, it's a warning, because the truth is that we've learned from history that problems that start in places like Sudan, they don't end there. And so our call in this report is obviously to pay attention to this. Just 12% of the global population live in the 20 countries that we feature. 85% of the people in humanitarian need live in just these 20 countries. And so we're calling for attention to it, but also mitigation of their suffering.
And in terms of the New World Disorder, and you talked about what defines them, but some of the things you've talked about in the report, they sound like they're hinting at something. So when they talk about, you talk about shifting alliances, but transactional deal making, and more rivals and risks. Is sort of, as I was reading it.
Do you think I'm talking about your neighbor? Is that what you're trying to hint at?
I am trying to ask you whether these are a symptom of Donald Trump. Would the decline that you, at the scale that we're seeing, would it be as harrowing if it were not for his presidency?
No, there's a major impact of this administration. It sets out to be a revolutionary administration, and it's undoubtedly having a massive impact on global affairs right around the world. And we know that in our own sector, because any conflict that you look at, the United States is playing a major role in some way or another, diplomatic, political, etc. But also, obviously, they've cut 83% of their grants and contracts of the support they originally gave, or they used to give, to the global aid system. 1/3 almost of the global aid system was American. It was the anchor of the global system. So what we talk about in our report is that the old order was defined by rules that nations were meant to live up to and rights that civilians were meant to have. Both of those are in retreat. And the administration is part of this new world disorder, and it's something that has to be addressed.
Well, and in fact, I think I have a stat here that 83% of USAID programs were canceled. I mean, that obviously has to have a ripple effect, and perhaps, unfortunately, lead by example when you look at then other countries putting a different kind of emphasis on their aid, including Canada. You just met with our Prime Minister, and Canada is also changing its focus in the last budget, cutting its own plans for foreign aid. As I said, you met with the Prime Minister. What specifically did you ask of him, and what did you hear back from him?
Well, we made a case that we've got to make the aid money go as far as possible. We understand that there are constraints, there are challenges, there are economic challenges that governments are facing. But we always make the case both that aid is a good investment. When we vaccinate a kid in East Africa for $2, that's a good investment, not just something that gives a lifelong benefit to that kid. And we talked today with the Prime Minister about the evidence of how aid makes a difference, the innovation that we're doing. We're just today, just this week, we're trialing a new way of using AI to diagnose monkeypox in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's innovation in the aid sector. And also, we're not afraid to talk about value for money. We should talk about driving up cost effectiveness and cost efficiency. Those are things that have marked out the International Rescue Committee. We do 1/3 of all the impact evaluations in the world of what actually works in humanitarian aid. And so the case we made was that this is a good investment for Canada. We've been long-term partners of GAC, Global Affairs Canada. We want to build on that.
And do you feel that your message, how did that message land?
I mean, you've got a Prime Minister who is extremely worldly, extremely smart, extremely clear about the challenges that, if you like, the Western world faces. So it was an incredibly serious and I thought important conversation for us, because he was able to bring us into the thinking that he's bringing to how to make sure that Canadian dollars go as far as possible, but also that in institutions like the World Bank and other G7, G20 forums, the Canadian voice about priorities, but also about how to make sure that a connected world doesn't become a more disordered one, how those Canadian ideas are taken forward.
Now, you know, you're trying to get this message out, and I'm asking you, you know, how it landed with the Prime Minister, but in terms of even a global audience, you know, when I read parts of this report, at some point it sort of makes you lose your breath. I mean, we're talking about 61 conflicts recorded globally in 2024. The outlook for 2026, as you've been saying, makes it just your eyes water at the thought of what we're facing. And I wonder why it does seem, and maybe it's just my impression, that people seem inured. People say apathetic, but they just, I guess I'm wondering why the suffering that we're reading about, that we're hearing about, and sometimes seeing on the news, why that's not moving people more.
Well, I think you're pointing to something really important. The world's more connected than ever before. And what you're saying is somehow empathy is becoming more divided than ever before. Here's my take on that. If you say, look, there are 235 million people in humanitarian need and we want to help them, it sounds like we're asking people to climb Mount Everest. I mean, it sounds just huge. If we say, look, 85% of that 235 million people live in just 20 countries. 30 million people just in Sudan are in humanitarian need. I think part of our job is to make this more manageable. It's to say, look, in just these 20 countries, we've got to focus our attention. At the moment, only 25% of the global aid budget, not just the Canadian budget, the global aid budget, only 25% goes on the fragile and conflict states where most of the extreme poor are located. We've got to make it manageable also in terms of programs that work. That's why I put this emphasis on evidence-based programs. For each of our programs, I can show you what the impact is: early childhood education, vaccination, malnutrition, and I can show you the cost effectiveness of it. And I think if we break it down in that way, our experience, we've lost a lot of US government money over the last year, but actually the public in the United States, as far afield as Korea, they're actually stepping up. So I don't think it's compassion fatigue. I think it's people seeking a real sense of agency, and we want to be able to give them a sense of that.
Now, Sudan does top the list, and I think this is now topping it the third year in a row. What does that say about the shape and the state of global politics?
I think it says it's broken. I mean, Sudan is an avatar for the new world disorder because it's a civil war that's ravaging its civilian population. It's a civil war that's supported by a dozen or more neighboring countries who are interfering in this civil war. It's an avatar because the global diplomacy has broken down, vetoes in the UN Security Council, inability of the UN to get its diplomatic teeth there. And it's an avatar because the UN humanitarian appeal, the most basic life-saving appeal, is 35% funded. So people are not getting the help they need. And so I think it says a lot about global politics. It's a symptom of how global politics is going wrong.
Well, you mentioned the UN, and that leads me to my next question, because in terms of recommendations, things you want to see happen, do you have faith that in institutions, you know, that you're asking for change, you're asking for specific things for these institutions to take on, the UN, other support systems, international cooperation? Do you have faith that what's required, which includes institutions like the UN changing or shifting, whether we're talking about vetoes or whether we're talking about fully funding programs they're supposed to fund, any faith that that's actually going to happen, that this can actually turn around?
Well, I would say that these multilateral institutions are only as strong as the commitment of the member states to make them work. So when we talk about gridlock in the UN Security Council, that's not a bureaucratic problem, it's a political problem.
So do you have faith that the politics can...
Well, I think we have to make the case for reform, because there are 193 countries in the world, not just 15 on the UN Security Council or 5 with a permanent membership and with a veto. And I think that there is a real imperative to make sure that these institutions are reformed better to reflect the modern era. I mean, one example we give, the veto, we say, should be suspended in cases of mass atrocity, because in the Sudans of this world, the use of the veto is getting in the way of effective action. It doesn't reflect the world as it is, it reflects the world as it was in 1945. We're a long way from getting that. But there are far more basic, more limited things where I think it makes sense to tackle these problems rather than to hope they go away. And so if you ask, do I have faith? I'm an optimistic person. You've got to be if you've been in politics, and now I'm in the humanitarian world. You take strength from the people I met in Somalia last week, who've been ravaged by civil conflict, but they're determined that they're going to make something of their lives. I was in Sudan, just to finish the point, and a woman has lost her husband in front of her eyes, killed by one of the militias. What keeps her going? She said to me, I want my kids to go to university. If people like that, and by the way, one of her kids is already at university in South Sudan. If people like that have strength and faith, then what right do we have to give it up?
Well, I really appreciate your time on this. It's a report everyone should read.
Thank you.
And internalize. Thank you very much.
Take action.
Yes, and take action. David Miliband is the President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. Thank you.
Thanks very much.